Or if you want to pick up a Bible off the table back there, we're in Exodus. We've been studying Exodus for some time now, and last time we were together, last Wednesday, we left off kind of in the middle of chapter 21. So Exodus chapter 21 is where we'll start, and we've been looking at different laws. We spent a little time with the Ten Commandments earlier, and then after the Ten Commandments, there were some special effects and fire and smoke, and then we have a book of the covenant, and so there are lots of laws, and my Bible has little headings, and so if you look at the beginning of chapter 21, it talks about Hebrew servants, and you think, well, why would he start with slavery? Well, you have to remember that these people were fresh out of slavery. They had been slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years, and so this is part of their orientation with life. They thought in those terms, and so here we have from the very get-go, God saying, okay, it's going to be different now. There's not going to be a slave for your whole life unless that's what you choose. There's going to be a limit to these things. And so as we read the laws last week, we see the way that God has placed his love and his care for the people. And so there's some abiding principles that take place. And we stopped last week around verse 22, I think. It says, if people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there's no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Sometimes you hear that quoted as an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. They leave out all the bruises and all the other parts of it. I guess that's too much to remember. And that's found 3 places in the law, but each time it is meant to de-escalate a situation. Our human nature is that we escalate situations. If somebody does us wrong, we do them wrong, and then they do us wrong, and then we do them wrong, and it's a constant thing back and forth until we've injured and hurt each other so much that nobody is still standing. That is what we do as humans. And so this law that God gives to the people is intended to rein them in. If somebody takes out your eye, the worst you ought to be able to do to them is take out their eye. And so there is a equity that is introduced. There is a sense of making things fair and not escalating a situation beyond. And so this is the way this law is introduced in God's Word. But you are familiar, of course, with the teachings of Jesus. And Jesus will quote this very law, and he will say, you have heard it said of old, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, I say to you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on your right cheek, hit him back harder. Is that what he says? Cheek for cheek. No, that's not what he says. He says, turn the other cheek. Now, in some ways, you can think of this eye for an eye thing as being a guide for civil law. So this is how nations are to implement laws. And so many of the laws of our country have their foundation in these laws that God gave long ago. Unfortunately, that foundation is kind of being pulled out from under us, and the house is going to fall down, depending on how the foundation gets pulled. So here we have this precept, and that is a governance for civil law. And the reason I say civil law is not everybody has a relationship with Jesus Christ. But for those of us who do, Jesus says we have to behave differently. We need to behave differently. So he said, you've heard it said an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but that's not how my people live. We are to return good for evil. We are to feed our enemy. We are to give a cup of cold water to the person who has said ugly things about us. We are to pray for the one who has mistreated us and not pray that bad things will happen to them. We're to pray that good things will happen and that they will be able to be drawn closer to the Lord through all of these things. And that's rather radical. Would y'all agree? Is it easy to put Jesus' teachings into practice? No, it is not. It requires that we depend on God. And Jesus sets the example for us. Peter points out when they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. Instead, he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. And so as Christians, that's what we're supposed to do. When we are injured, when we are harmed, when we are offended, when somebody does us wrong, we're not to retaliate. We are instead to entrust that to God, to know that God in his justice, God in his wisdom will take care of things, and we don't have to. We are freed from having to worry about that. And that is a tremendous freedom. That enables us to be able to forgive and to be kind and to be loving and to live out the teachings of Christ without this need to get revenge or retaliate or see that justice is done. So Jesus teaches us a whole different way to live. Now, he says, you've heard it said of old, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, if somebody strikes you on your right cheek, turn to them your left. Does that take courage? It takes a tremendous amount of courage, because there is a good probability that you're going to get hit at least twice, right? There's a real good chance of that. Does Jesus want us to walk around bruised and broken? No, not necessarily, although he did for us. But to turn the other cheek gives an opportunity for reconciliation. And we are to be agents of reconciliation, bringing people back to God. And so Jesus tells us to turn the other cheek. He tells us to go the second mile. He tells us to give to the one who asks of us. He tells us not to take each other to court. All of those things are intended to help us to live very differently from the world by a whole different standard. And yes, it's difficult to do that. It requires us to depend on God. So, having interpreted this passage in Exodus 21 in light of Jesus' words, kind of helps us know what to do as we keep reading. Because throughout, we will see God's love and concern for the poor. We'll see the way God is at work to preserve a people and to lay a really good foundation. But it is Jesus' law of love that is found right here in the Old Testament that is the law that kind of fulfills and brings everything together. Jesus said, I did not come to abolish the law. The law will not be going anywhere. I have come to fulfill the law. And Jesus did that in a number of ways. He fulfilled it by keeping it. He kept the law. And he fulfilled it because he's the only one in human history that has. He kept the law. And he fulfills it by giving us a proper understanding of it. Sometimes we follow the rules blindly without knowing what or why, and we get in trouble that way because we don't really know why we're doing what we do, and we inadvertently do the wrong thing because we didn't understand what we were supposed to do in the first place. Well, Jesus helps us to know the why. He helps us to know the spirit of the law that we can follow. And there's another principle that's introduced in these things, and I think I pointed it out last week, so I know I've repeated myself some from last week to this week, but and that's the idea of intentionality. As you read through this, it's important why people do what they do. It's not just the end result. Some people will say that the ends justify the means. That's not what Scripture teaches at all. Why we do what we do is very, very important. And how we behave along the way. Well, notice, if you will, that it is a pregnant woman in question here that is part of this law. And so we see here God's desire to preserve life. Do you all remember the very first command he gave to Adam and Eve? Well, I do. It was to be fruitful and multiply, right? God is on the side of life. And God is at work to preserve life in all of its forms. And so here there is protection, even from these men who are fighting. An owner let's see, I'm at verse 26. An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. All right, so notice that there's a slightly different standard here. It's no longer eye for eye and tooth for tooth. Now it's freedom in exchange for an eye. So the intention there, though, is to keep the slave owner in check. Because who is losing if he has to set the slave free early? The slave owner himself, right? And if the owner knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave, they must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. And so you see some exceptions here to this eye for an eye, tooth for tooth pronouncement that's given earlier. If a bull gores a man or woman to death, and the bull is to be stoned to death, and its meat must not be eaten, but the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. So again, preservation of life and seeking to protect people and property. If, however, the bull has had a habit of goring and the owner has been warned but has not kept it pinned up and it kills a man or woman, the bull is to be stoned to death and the owner must be put to death. However, if payment is demanded, the owner may redeem his life by the payment of whatever is demanded. The law also applies if the bull gores a son or a daughter. If the bull gores a male or female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave, and the bull is to be stoned to death. So a lot of that is a bit confusing to us, but again, it relates to intention. And the idea that we not only have to look after our stuff, we really need to look after our neighbor's welfare, our neighbor's life. We don't want to do anything that intentionally harms someone else. We don't want our negligence to create problems for someone else or to end someone else's life. And so, again, the principle at work here is the preservation of life, and we see that all the way through. But it is interesting, if a slave is killed, they must pay how many pieces of silver? 30 shekels of silver. That sounds familiar to me. Have y'all ever heard that? Yes, it's what Judas got. It's what Zechariah prophesied the Messiah will be betrayed for as well. So it is the price of a slave. And that fits into the theology because Jesus became a slave on our behalf. He emptied himself. He did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but emptied himself, took on human form, was obedient as a slave, obedient as a servant, even to the point of death. Well, verse 33. If anyone uncovers a pit or digs one and fails to cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the one who opened the pit must pay the owner for the loss and take the dead animal in exchange. If anyone's bull injures someone else's bull and it dies, the two parties are to sell the live one and divide both the money and the dead animal equally. However, if it has been known that the bull had the habit of goring and yet the owner did not keep it pinned up, the owner must pay animal for animal and take the dead animal in exchange. So, if you're wondering what the take-home message tonight is, it's keep your bulls pinned up, especially if they're violent toward others. But again, there's the idea of fairness and equity and trying to make things right to be able to live together in a just society. Chapter 22, whoever steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. Whew, that's pretty stiff penalties. So I think I mentioned this last week. You'll notice there's no jail mentioned here. So we would put a thief in jail. They would say the thief needs to make up for what they've done. So there needs to be restitution. That's another big principle that runs all the way through here. So if you have stolen something, you need to pay it back 4 or 5 times the amount. Do y'all remember a story in the New Testament where that comes into play? Well, Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem to give his life for you and for me, And there was a little man, a wee little man. What was that man's name? Zacchaeus climbed a sycamore tree. Y'all remember? And Jesus stopped at the base and said, Zacchaeus, come down. I'm having lunch with you today. I'm coming to your house. And Jesus did. And he announces after lunch that salvation has come to this house. And Zacchaeus says, listen, if I have cheated anybody, and he had, I'm going to pay them how much? Yeah, 4 times or more back what I stole from them. And so here's the basis for that idea, because Zacchaeus had robbed his neighbors and profited himself as a tax collector. If a thief is caught breaking in the night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. So here's a basic principle that you have a right to defend your life and the lives of your children, the lives of your household. So if somebody breaks into your house at night and in protecting your family, you injure them, then you are not held at fault for that. But then look at what's next. But if it happens after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed. Now, what makes the difference? Well, at night, you have limited help. And at night, someone can disguise their identity. In the daytime, you can call for help because basically everybody's living in an outdoor sort of community. So, and the houses aren't that far apart. So somebody breaks in, you call for help, and the community responds, and you know who the person is that's robbing you. So you would just turn them in, right? You don't have to beat them over the head or anything. You just say, hey, so-and-so stole my goat. Right? And so there's a different provision for daylight.
The law that delineates between burglary and midnight.
Okay.
Totally different charge, different sin.
Okay. So many of these principles hold true to our laws today. And notice, if you will, here's another principle that kind of shines through. Thieving, sin is sin. Let me say that from the outset. All sin leads to death. So in a theological, biblical sense, lying and murder and theft, they all separate us from God, and they all lead to death. But notice the penalties here, that property is not as important as life. And that's a whole another principle that would have been foreign to the Egyptians and to the cultures around them. And so there's a heavy emphasis on the fact that we are to use things and love people and not the other way around. Anyone who steals must certainly make restitution. That's something we've kind of been driving home with. But if they have nothing, they must be sold to pay for their theft. So here you have kind of an indentured service, and we go back to chapter 21 to realize that it's for a limited period of time, no more than 7 years, but it ends that cycle of debt. I think I said last week that if the credit card companies could catch on to that, that would be a really good thing, that you could become debt-free after 7 years. That could be a very powerful tool to set our country right. So here, if you don't have the money to pay for what you've stolen, you're sold into indentured servitude. If the stolen animal is found alive in their possession, whether an ox or a donkey or a sheep, they must pay back double. If anyone grazes their livestock in a field or vineyard and lets them stray and they graze in someone else's field, the offender must make, what's that word again? Restitution from the best of his own field or vineyard. If a fire breaks out and spreads into the thorn bushes so that it burns shocks of grain or standing grain or the whole field, the one who started the fire must make restitution. If anyone gives a neighbor silver or goods for safekeeping, so there's not really a safe deposit box at the bank or that kind of thing. If anyone gives these things to a neighbor for safekeeping and they are stolen from the neighbor's house, the thief, if caught, must pay back double. But if the thief is not found, the owner of the house must appear before the judges, and they must determine whether the owner of the house has laid hands on the other person's property. In all cases of illegal possession of an ox, a donkey, a sheep, a garment, or any other lost property about which someone says, "This is mine," both parties are to bring their cases before the judges, and the one whom the judges declare guilty must pay back double to the other. So, realizing that sometimes it's not clear who is at fault or who is guilty, the idea here is to bring them before the judge. And you remember earlier in Exodus that these judges were appointed as men who had been instructed by Moses and men who are dedicated to equity. They don't take bribes, and so it should produce a fair system. If anyone gives a donkey or an ox or sheep or other animal to their neighbor for safekeeping, and it dies or is injured or is taken away while no one is looking, the issue between them will be settled by the taking of an oath before the Lord that the neighbor did not lay hands on the other person's property. The owner is to accept this, and no restitution is required. Now, it's interesting, one of the 10 Commandments is not to give false witness, and I think I pointed out to you at the time that in a culture that didn't think twice about killing somebody, breaking an oath was really serious. So if you made an oath before the Lord, there would be consequences if you were lying when you made that oath. But if the animal was stolen from the neighbor, restitution must be made to the owner. If it was torn to pieces by a wild animal, the neighbor shall bring in the remains as evidence and shall not be required to pay for the torn animal. If anyone borrows an animal from the neighbor and it's injured or dies while the owner is not present, they must make restitution. But if the owner is with the animal, the borrower will not have to pay. And if the animal was hired, the money paid for the hire covers the loss. So I don't know if y'all have ever read the small print on rental agreements or that kind of thing, but here we have just some basic principles to establish some fairness, equity, and restitution. And then we move on to some social responsibility. And all of this also sounds very strange to our ears. But in this particular culture, a daughter would bring income to her family as she is given away in marriage. And so if a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. So promiscuity, is that allowed in Hebrew culture? No, it's not. Now, people are sinful, people are evil. I'm sure it took place, and some of these laws are here because it takes place. But you remember that when one man and one woman come together, the scripture says they form one flesh. And so it's that idea that this is a permanent, lasting relationship. And that one flesh commitment comes whether they're married or not. And so if a man seduces a young lady, he marries her. Unless the father absolutely refuses to give her to him. Now, might there be a father that might do such a thing? Well, yes, particularly if this guy's a rascal and the father doesn't think his daughter's going to, be able to survive well with him. If the father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must pay the bride price for virgins. Do not allow a sorceress to live. No. So, who created the universe again? God. If a power is not from God, where is it from? Paul will tell us in Ephesians that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. In Ephesians, Paul identifies Satan as the prince of the air. So there is an enemy who is at work. You remember earlier in Exodus, Moses and Aaron would perform a miracle, and then what would Pharaoh's men do? They would copy it. So there is demonic power at work in our world. Anyone who has sexual relations with an animal is to be put to death. And, well, that sort of makes sense. But there's another element here. God is distinguishing his people from their neighbors. And unfortunately, their neighbors, even in the midst of worshiping their idols and false gods, participated in this awful kind of thing. And so God is saying, no, my people are going to be different. Which leads us to the next one. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord must be destroyed. And the word there is a different word than what is used throughout the rest of the law. It's the same word. You may remember in the book of Joshua and other places, there would be cities that would belong to the Lord. And so God would tell them, hey, don't take anything in this city for yourself. Don't profit from it at all. It is to be an offering to the Lord. And that's the word that's used here. Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. So can you kind of see, I know this is a different culture, a different context, and a lot of these things sound very strange to our ears, but can you see the principle of love your neighbor as you love yourself kind of shine through many of these things? They had been foreigners in Egypt. They had been mistreated in Egypt. Don't mistreat the foreigner in your land. Don't take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. Did they have Social Security? They did not. So a widow was dependent on her children. How about an orphan? He is dependent on the kindness of strangers, right? So here it says, do not mistreat, do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. We get to the New Testament, and James will tell us that true religion is to take care of the widow, take care of the orphan, and to keep ourselves pure from the evils of this world. Do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless. You remember that Exodus begins because God has heard the cries of his people. And so God reminds them that he hears the cry of those who are mistreated by society and will act in accordance with that. If you lend money to one of my people, notice God's possessiveness there, my people, if you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal. Charge no interest. Now, I know banks, our banks are in kind of rough shape right now. Had some fail this past weekend. But this would be news to the banks, wouldn't it? Charge no interest. It's not necessarily here talking about a banking system as much as it is an attempt for us to help each other. And so when we lend money, when we help one another, it's not to be a money-making deal. It's not to be something we profit from. It's to genuinely be a way to help other people. And so he says, charge no interest. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it by sunset. All right, this lets you know a few things. One is there are people who are so poor that all they can offer as collateral is their coat. And what's God's intention? Does he want people sleeping out in the cold? Nope. Return it by sunset. Because that cloak is the only covering your neighbor has. What else can they sleep in? And when they cry out to me, I will hear, for, how does God describe himself? I am compassionate. He knows our struggles. He feels our pain. He is with us in our trouble. God is compassionate. And so, when we're in distress, who should we cry out to? God. Will he hear us? Yes. If there are those in our community who are in distress, we need to seek to help them and not take advantage of them and hurt them, for they can cry out to God. Do not blaspheme God or curse the ruler of your people. Don't blaspheme God. Well, that makes sense. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Honor the Lord's name. Let it be holy. Hallowed be thy name, Jesus tells us. What about the ruler of your people, though? I mean, now he's talking about politics. Don't curse the ruler of your people. Well, one way or another, God has allowed that person to be in charge. It may be temporary. It may be for God's purposes. But we are to honor those and pray for those who are placed in authority over us, whether we agree with their politics or not. That's what the New Testament teaches. We are to pray for those who are in authority, who have been placed in authority over us. And so here we see part of that principle: do not curse the ruler of your people. Fast forward a little bit to the time of the prophets, and as the people are taken into captivity in Babylon, God will tell them, pray for the peace of Babylon. Pray for the cities in which you live. Why is that? Well, because as the city you live in prospers, you prosper. And so here he says, don't curse the ruler of your people. Don't hold back offerings from your granaries or your vats. You must give the firstborn of your sons. Do the same for your cattle and your sheep. Let them stay in with their mothers for 7 days, but give them to me on the 8th day. You are to be my holy people. So do not eat meat from any animal torn by wild beasts. Throw it instead to the dogs. So why the firstborn? Why does God want the firstborn of all the cattle and even the sons? Well, turn back a few more pages, and you remember the 10th plague in Egypt. God sent the angel of death, and those houses whose door frames were covered with the blood of the Lamb, the angel of death passed over. You remember? So from that moment on, the firstborn all belonged to God. Those who died and those who lived. And so if you go back to the story there are instructions about how a firstborn son is to be redeemed. God does not want them to sacrifice their children. That's what the pagan nations did. But they are to commit, they are to dedicate, they are to redeem their firstborn child to the Lord. Joseph and Mary followed this practice. And the law said that you should give a lamb to redeem your firstborn son, but if you're poor, can't afford a lamb, you are to give turtle doves. What did Joseph and Mary do as they dedicated Jesus in the temple? They gave doves. What does that say about Joseph and Mary? They were poor. And then soon after in the story, they become refugees in Egypt, have to leave in the middle of the night to get away from King Herod and his soldiers. Well, the firstborn belonged to the Lord. Now, on my way home last night, I saw some deer along the road. Should we maybe have some kind of supper or something with the animals on the side of the road? Why not? All right. All right. Is there a chance it could make us sick? So there are some practical elements to these laws as well. God is preserving life. He is protecting his people, and he has set them apart to be holy. Why does God give the law? Is it intended to limit us or hurt us? It's for our good. It's to guide us. It's because he loves us. It's because he wants to preserve our life. And so the law is good. The law is intended to help us. The law shows us God's intention. It shows us God's love, his care. Now, unfortunately, we are good at taking good things and using them for evil. So we can take the law and use it to beat people over the head with, and we can use it very legalistically and judgmentally, and God's people did all those things. And so by the time we get to the New Testament, Paul is saying, hey, the law is not going to save you. You need Jesus. The law shows you just how far away you are from God. But here we see the law in a very positive way. It's intended to help the people. Chapter 23, do not spread false reports. Do not help a guilty person by being a malicious witness. So we already have the command not to bear false testimony, but here it's reiterated because of our human tendency to do the wrong thing. Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. Now, that one probably ought to be written on a lot of mirrors and places where teenagers and young people and young adults and medium-age adults and older adults can see it. Would y'all agree? Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd, and do not show favoritism, even to a poor person, in the lawsuit. You will notice here in these commands that for the most part, God is on the side of the poor. He hears the cries of the oppressed. He will respond. There'll be provisions to help the poor. But notice in this verse and several others, there's no favoritism toward the poor. Does being poor necessarily make you holy? No, it can. It can make you dependent on God, or you realize your dependence on God and you're closer to God, but there are an awful lot of mean-spirited poor people too. And so he says, even if they're poor, don't just side with them because of that. Don't deny justice. Well, I skipped one, but he'll give us the other side of that. If you come across your enemy's ox, okay, what's an enemy? That's somebody who's mistreated you, somebody who says ugly things about you, somebody who is malicious in their actions towards you. Would y'all agree? Does that sound like an enemy to y'all? All right, you see your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off. So you could say, all right, didn't like that person anyway. They're going to lose a donkey. They're going to lose an ox. But what should we do instead? Be sure to return it. If you see the donkey of someone who hates you falling down under his load, do not leave it there. Be sure you help them with it. Is this in the Old Testament? These verses I'm reading? All right. In the New Testament, Jesus tells us to love our enemies and do good to those who hate us. Are the Old Testament and the New Testament really that far apart? No, we see the principles right here. And in verse 6, in case we misunderstood verse 3, do not deny justice to your poor people in their lawsuits. So there's no favoritism shown, but you also can't deny them justice. Have nothing to do with a false charge. Do not give an innocent or an honest person do not put an innocent or honest person to death, for I will not acquit the guilty. Do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds those who see and twists the words of the innocent. Do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners, because you were foreigners in Egypt. So some of these things are being repeated. Why do you think God repeats them? Yes. I think I've told you that when I first started teaching this class for the high school, I just thought if I could explain it really well, all the students would get it. And they would just make 100 on all their tests and things would just be great. What I have discovered is that it doesn't help to say it one time. You have to say it 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 or 20 times before it actually sinks in and they're able to say it back with you. So it takes repeating, and it does for us too. Don't oppress a foreigner. Do foreigners get oppressed in today's world, in today's society? Yes, they do.
And I used to, when my girls were teenagers, they got speeding tickets. Girls big tickets, wrecks every other week or something. And I used to tell them, you know, I used to run out the door following them. I'd say, make sure, if Mama, if you tell me one more time that I'm doing that, I still had a habit of doing that when they were driving,
Okay?
saying it more than one time.
Yep, they need to hear it. Look at verse 10. For 6 years you're to sow your fields and harvest your crops, but during the 7th year let the land lie fallow and unused. That seems odd, doesn't it? So you plant crops 6 years and then let it rest a year. Now, that's a pattern we've seen before, hadn't we? Manna would fall 6 days, and on the 7th day it wouldn't fall, right? Honor the Sabbath day, the 7th day, and keep it holy. So they're supposed to do that with years and with the land as well. Look at the explanation. Then the poor among you, among your people, may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat what's left. Do the same with your vineyards and with your olive grove. We know from other places in Scripture and just from practical life that this is a really good plan. What happens if you don't let land rest periodically? It does. So it will not, in theory, you don't observe a Sabbath rest, then eventually the land no longer produces. 6 days do your work, but on the 7th day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest. Does God care about people? Yes. Does he care about donkeys? He does. So that the slave born in your household and the foreigner living among you may be refreshed. Be careful to do everything I have said to you. Do not invoke the names of other gods, and do not let them be heard on your lips. So God has called his people to be separate. God's called his people to be holy. We get to the New Testament, and Peter will write, the Lord has said, be holy because I am holy. God wanted his people to be different from all of their neighbors. Do you think God wants us to be different from all of our neighbors? He really does. He wants us to be people of love, people of kindness, people who depend on him, people who are going to take care of an enemy's animal, people who are going to treat people with equity and fairness and without partiality. He wants his people to live differently. He wants them to live by the law of love that Jesus says fulfills all the laws. Well, thank you for your patience with me tonight as we've looked at these. I know it's written in a different time to a different culture, and a lot of the things kind of make us wonder and scratch our heads because we don't live in this time and in this culture, and yet there's some very valuable insights into God's plan and purpose for his people that apply to us today. This kind of concludes that section of Exodus. And so next week, as we pick up, we'll look at some festivals, some holidays that God establishes for the people, and then God's promise to take care of them and to send an angel ahead. And so there's a lot of good things in store for us as we continue in God's Word. Father, thank you. Thank you for the instruction and the help that your Word gives us. Thank you for the principles that still are at work today in our laws and in our hearts. Help us to love people the way you love people. Help us to take care of animals the way you take care of animals. Help us, Father, that we would be mindful even of the folks who are disadvantaged and are struggling in our midst, that we would be a channel of your love and of your mercy and of your grace. Give us a sensitivity to your Spirit as we seek to live by the law of love.